What if we could type bell hooks type beat, but instead of beat, we replace it with writer? What would come up? Who would come up with that similar kind of vibe? Goodreads did not do a good job of recommending a good alternative. The closest Black woman that popped up was Patricia Hill Collins, who is technically Bell Hooks' contemporary. I would say Brittany Cooper and Roxane Gay are a very, very close runner-up, in my opinion. But I'm thinking about the millennial and Gen Z version of Bell Hooks, right? Because so many of us now, it's popular to quote her, say that we've read her books, but who's going to be quoting us in the next 40 years or beyond? So where is the Bell Hooks of the millennial and Gen Z era? Or how do we create her? Ask most Black women what their favorite Bell Hooks book is, and they'll probably say The Will to Change. The book was written in 2004 and still has cultural significance 19 years later, probably because the way the internet and social media is revealing more and more men like the ones Hooks wrote about. The culture of dating and marriage is a hot topic now as well, and lots of millennials and Gen Zers are reading folks like Hooks in order to figure out their thoughts on relationships. At least with heterosexual relationships, the conversations around toxic masculinity, pick-me energy, and high-value men or women has escalated to a dangerous point, from insults to physical threats on people's lives. Some statistics. In 2004, when the book was published, the percentage of American Black men who were never married decreased with age. In other words, 20 to 29-year-olds were more than twice as likely to be unmarried versus 30 to 39-year-olds. Numbers were similar for American Black women in the same age groups. So the older you got, the less likely it was that you remained unmarried. In 2022, the total percentage of Black men and women who were never married both hung around 50%, give or take 2 percentage points. But there were more unmarried Black women in raw numbers compared to unmarried Black men. Black Americans were also getting married much later or much older than other couples of any other race. There could be many of reasons why this is the case, finances and career stability being one of them. Commentary from Black male-led podcasts and some Black woman-led podcasts might suggest that it goes deeper than that, and words like misogynoir come to mind. As Bell Hooks points out in her book, the imperialist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchy that we live in also affects LGBTQIA relationships, with certain partners in those relationships mimicking the oppressive approach to power in a harmful way in order to maintain a sense of control when things feel out of control. So the question of the day is, who's offering Bell Hooks level commentary on relationships in the Black community today? And how does their writing style help readers understand and think about this issue? To begin, let's talk about the approach Bell Hooks takes in her book, The Will to Change, and see if we can find any similar patterns in the writing of millennial and Gen Z feminists or womanists of today. So in The Will to Change, I believe Bell Hooks has 2 theses. The first one comes from this quote: "When culture is based on a dominator model, not only will it be violent, but it will frame all relationships as power struggles." In this, we get our classic Bell Hooks argument about the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy causing mayhem, but in this regard, pitting marginalized groups against each other, namely Black men and Black women. She also talks about how basically this power structure that is systemic also impacts queer relationships as well, that they're not exempt from this. And essentially she's saying that in this society where white supremacy is at the top and they wield capitalism and patriarchy as their tools to oppress certain groups, Black men in this system try to take hold of the master's tools, take hold of this power within white supremacy, and then wield it against whoever is below them. And that usually is Black women. So if this systemic issue stays in place, there will always be a constant struggle against Black men and Black women that is going to prevent us from having a reconciled romantic or platonic relationship. Thesis number 2 comes from this quote: "Patriarchy demands of men that they become and remain emotional cripples, and to create loving men, we must love males. Loving maleness is different from praising and rewarding males for living up to sexist-defined notions of male identity." I think that this is really at the crux of what Bell Hooks wants us to take away after reading the book, The Will to Change. And it basically, in some says, we need to love the hate out of men. That's essentially what she's saying. But if I were to make it a little bit more concrete, she is saying that as a feminist or as womanist in this fight against white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, we may need to hold space for men to learn and unlearn the survival tactics that they are using to navigate this, again, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. That means giving them grace when they mess up. I mean, obviously, we need to tread with caution with regards to that, and we'll talk about that later on in this video. But essentially understand that they are just as much victims of this systemic issue as we are. And unfortunately, as a method of self-preservation, they have seen us as people to subjugate instead of seeing us as partners in liberation. To make these points that she has to support her two theses, Bell Hooks used two main literary devices that we'll talk about. Number one, anecdotes. And number two, something called Rogerian argumentation, which, if you don't know the definition, don't worry, we'll talk about it. But let's start with anecdotes. Anecdotes is basically painting a picture using stories to illustrate a point. And for the majority of the book, Bell Hooks is using her personal life, basically relying heavily on her parents' marriage, her personal relationship with her father, and also her romantic relationships with men. And here are just a couple of examples. Regarding her parents' relationship, Bell Hooks writes, "My father and mother have been married now for more than 50 years. Dad has never relinquished his patriarchal status. She has never challenged it. Yet by clinging to patriarchal thinking, they forfeited their chance to be happy together. The threat of violence, of emotional abuse, is always there, standing in the way of intimacy, keeping them from forgiving one another and starting over. Sadly, they're stuck in the trap of patriarchy." Regarding her relationship with her father, Hooks writes, "My longing for my father's death began in childhood. It was the way I responded to his rage, his violence. I used to dream him gone, dead and gone. Death was the only way out of the fear evoked by the proclamation, 'Wait till your father gets home.' The threat of punishment was so intense, his power over us so real, I used to think if only he could die, we could live." And finally, regarding her romantic relationships, Bell Hooks writes, "I did not want to hear the pain of my male partner, because hearing it required that I surrender my investment in the patriarchal ideal of the male as protector of the wounded. If he was wounded, then how could he protect me?" In the few instances that Bell Hooks is criticized, it is often because she relies heavily on her personal experiences to support her scholarly arguments. But her proponents would argue that that's actually the revolutionary thing about Bell Hooks, is that she makes her work accessible to people who are outside of academia, the average Black woman who can feel empowered and enlightened by her work. One could also argue that her Rogerian approach to argumentation is revolutionary within the feminist/womanist realm, because oftentimes people consider feminists to be anti-male or anti-anyone who is against feminism, and in other words, very hyper-combative. But let's first define what Rogerian argumentation is. It comes from the field of psychology, and it is defined as a form of argumentative reasoning that aims to establish a middle ground between parties with opposing viewpoints or goals. Put it plainly, Bell Hooks is seeing both sides of the argument, even though she does not say that that means that her argument is any less valid. That's not to say that she concedes her argument by considering the other side, but she gives the other side an attempt to be validated, to see where their points are either accurate or make sense given the context within which they're making the argument, or in this specific case, when it comes to talking about the relationship between men and women under a capitalistic patriarchy, tries to see the reason why men operate the way that they operate and give them grace and understanding. Two examples of Bell Hooks using Rogerian argumentation are found in these two quotes. "Men do oppress women. People are hurt by rigid sexist role patterns. These two realities coexist. Male oppression of women cannot be excused by the recognition that there are ways men are hurt by rigid sexist roles. Feminist activists should acknowledge that hurt and work to change it. It exists. It does not erase or lessen male responsibility for supporting and perpetuating their power under patriarchy to exploit and oppress women in a manner far more grievous than the serious psychological stress and emotional pain caused by male conformity to rigid sexist role patterns. And in another quote, we need to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally, even if men receive more rewards from that system. Dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. So now we know where bell hooks lies and how she makes her arguments. So we can do a compare and contrast between the millennial and Gen Z authors who are writing about these topics today, specifically Black and African women/femme authors. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is technically not a millennial, if I'm not mistaken, but because of her popularity, being quoted by Queen Beyonce, she is a fan favorite of millennials and the Gen Zers who know her. The rest of these authors are within the right age group, but I felt that the person who I could use as the best example of what to do and what not to do is the millennial author Morgan Jenkins. First, I'll start the same way I started with bell hooks, with telling you what I think is the thesis of Morgan Jenkins' book. This will be my undoing. It seems Jenkins tends to place emphasis on how patriarchy pits white, non-Black women against Black, dark-skinned women, rather than focusing on women against men. And I'll show why I think this with the following 3 quotes. A Black girl cannot just be good. She has to be better than good in order to meet the white female standard. If men want me and there's no other man by my side, then they feel as if they have a right to make advances towards me. That I don't want them is irrelevant. When men pursue Black women, the women are always considered culpable, as if their presence alone is an excuse for a male to act unlawfully. What is it about our goals that leads to our stigmatization? When we return to the folds of our community and find that we are denigrated for the skills we used to survive, what else can we do but suppress ourselves just so we'll have somebody? So the reason why these quotes make me feel Jenkins' approach is to focus or emphasize more on relationships between Black women and non-Black/white women versus relationships between men and Black women is because most of her experiences surround her desire to either mimic the type of women that men, including Black men, seem to be more attracted to, and also resenting that fact that she has to acquiesce to being like a white woman or like a non-Black woman in order to be seen as beautiful and worthy of love. She brings up the stereotypes that are often placed on Black women, like being sapphires, aka being hotheads, or being too successful to be willing to date down when it comes to dating Black men, or also being too successful in general, which means that they are almost asexual. Where Jenkins loses me is this final quote that she uses to end her chapter that is dedicated solely to the conversation around the male gaze and how that affects Black women living in a capitalistic patriarchal society. Before I read the quote, I will give some context. She tells a story that starts out, for whatever reason, with details about a seemingly poor, drug-addicted Black woman who approaches her asking for change. She feels the need to emphasize that the Black woman was missing teeth and that she wanted to get as far away from this woman as possible. I am not sure what this had to do with the conversation that she later brings up, but that's something for readers of her book to unpack on their own. She proceeds then to talk about a Black man who was in the same store or bodega that she was in when this woman approached her. This Black man comes up to her pitching concert tickets. And after going on his whole pitch and spiel about why she really needs to buy these tickets, he asks if he can have her phone number so that he can give her more details. And to that, Jenkins says no. And for whatever reason, the man then shouts obscenities towards her, including statements around her thinking that she's all that, and that he was just trying to do business and he had no interest in her sexually and didn't understand why she was assuming that that's why he wanted her phone number. After mentioning that, she says that she calls her best male friend to try to calm her down or make her feel safe. And then she starts to contemplate what would have happened if she contacted the police to report this harassment, which then leads to this quote where she writes, "I would subject myself to a black man's harassment 1,000 times over, rather than watch his face hit the pavement with the police officer's weight on his back. That's not justice. That is betrayal." Whatever point she was trying to make with this anecdote and then this final statement is beyond me. I think that whatever point she was trying to make was lost, especially regarding the unnecessary details that she includes in the story that leads up to this. And I guess what she's trying to say, if I were to summarize it, is that she believes that the police state is what prevents Black women from fully holding Black men accountable for their misogynoir and their patriarchal actions, especially when they're violent towards Black women. And I guess this argument came up when Meg Thee Stallion was talking about her incident with Tory Lanez. I'm not sure that the situation that Jenkins describes is in a similar category as Meg Thee Stallion's situation with Tory Lanez. Not to say that verbal abuse is not just as violent or can make Black women feel just as uncomfortable, but I don't see why the police would ever have to be involved in such a situation unless the man in the bodega actually put his hands on Jenkins. I think that she was too hyperbolic in this situation, and it kind of defeated the whole purpose of what she was trying to accomplish, which again I think is to demonstrate that Black women have this burden of proving that they can be as adjacent to white female or non-Black female features and characteristics in order to be loved or be taken seriously or to be protected. There are many other reasons why her points were lost when she was trying to make this argument in this chapter, which is chapter 4, by the way, of the book. And there wasn't any critical examination into the psychology of these Black men. It seemed more like it was a venting opportunity for Jenkins to get off her chest all the ways that Black men have wronged her and how it made her feel, versus trying to investigate the same way Bell Hooks does why they treated her and other Black women, not just her, in this way. So I'm going to close out this video by giving my 3 writing tips based on what I think went well and what did not go so well for both Bell Hooks and Morgan Jenkins, because both of them had strengths in their arguments and their approach to tackling this conversation, but there is definitely room and area for improvement, specifically because of the unique situation that we find ourselves in today. So writing tip number 1, we'll need to be more conscious of using irrefutable statistics in our conversations, because we're living in an age where our interlocutors are arguing in bad faith. Biggest example of this, the manosphere. How many times have you seen clips of men having podcast episodes with women around them, albeit usually women of a certain hue or demographic, who will make sure that they dominate the conversation? These men are not interested most of the time in hearing any opposing views, especially from dark-skinned Black women who might be invited onto their platforms, and are definitely eager to shut down anybody trying to speak up in the conversation. So it's not even a conversation, it's more of a one-way diatribe. In this situation, we are going to have to not make it so personal. In these conversations today, when you make yourself the center of the argument, the focus becomes you versus the system/the community. Her deductions of most of her arguments about Black womanhood come from her life, her unique circumstances as a Black woman. When we do use anecdotes, they need to be an illustration of big picture statistical trends versus standalone proof of our own personal feelings or positions. I think it's commendable that women like Bell Hooks wanted Black women who were outside of academia and could not understand the inaccessible language that comes within that space to understand important points that she wanted to make about breaking down systems of oppression. I definitely applaud that. However, it's time for us to step up to the plate and be a little bit more sophisticated for the sake of making sure that real change happens. Our interlocutors, the For example, podcasters are also using their personal experiences to refute our arguments, and they're speaking over us and they're speaking louder than us oftentimes. The only way, I think, to break down that argument in an effective way, in a way that it will be impossible for them to ignore, is to demonstrate large-scale trends, to show data, to show facts. I think it's at least still worth a try to demonstrate that we are not taking things personally. We are not trying to attack them as people, but we are trying to demonstrate a larger point for the greater good. My final writing point is this. Sometimes we are going to have to extend grace to the most nefarious interlocutors in this debate in ways that they can't deny that we've offered them a chance to be heard and understood. And I'm pulling this directly from Bell Hooks' call for us to love maleness, not the toxic parts of it. But I see her point there, and I think in this day and age where we're living in binaries in terms of who's right and who's wrong and what side you're on, this kind of nuanced approach to personhood just might do the trick. I can't guarantee it, of course, but I feel like it's worth a shot. Right now, a lot of us are just trying to scream louder than the other person, which is obviously something that we want to end. The only way that we can do that is potentially by helping them realize that there are ways for them to be successful. There are ways for them to overcome under this oppressive system if they lock hands with us and become our partners rather than our enemies. We also want to show them that they can be much better than what they are right now. I think there's something about speaking life and uplifting words over these men who would normally expect us to call them names and attack them right away. But attacking their personhood is not going to get them to acknowledge or to recognize how they are just as much of a victim as we are. I'm not going to say that it's easy. Lord knows I need a lot of prayer and meditation to even attempt this approach. And I think that if Black women do it as a collective, we could see it happen. So now over to you. Leave a comment. What Black or African women authors are you reading? Which of them, if any, talk about gender and relationships in a way that resonates with you? Also, feel free to leave a comment about any of my analyses about Bell Hooks and also Morgan Jenkins. Tell me if you agree. Tell me if you disagree. I just ask that you keep it respectful and please focus on the facts and the points made versus any personal attacks, because we don't know each other and we're just here to learn and grow. As always, I will ask if you would please subscribe to this channel and especially like this video to give me a signal that you want more content around how Black women should tell their stories in writing and how we can use writing to affect real social change on behalf of Black women across the diaspora.